Hey everyone, it's Victor Sue from Southfront.org and welcome to today's live stream, which is going to be an interview with our dear Desaker, who is a blogger and military analyst, and today we're going to talk with him about the Russian-Israeli relations, the situation in Syria, and we're going to talk about also the situation in Ukraine. So, just want to introduce you to Saker. As I told you, a dear friend to us, to our project, a blogger, military analyst, and we also have our military expert, Brian Kalman, with us as well. So, want to say hi to all of you. And before we start, just to give you some brief instructions on how this live stream is going to work. You can send questions and donate to our project. As you know, we are a crowdfunded project. So you can donate and get your questions to be answered when you type in southfront.org/questions, which I am typing right now on the screen that you can see. So you have to just type in your username, the donation amount, and in the message box, you just have to put in your question, and we will answer it for sure. Keep up the live chat as well in the live stream, and probably we have some. Okay, so we have Brian again reconnected. Also, YouTube super chat is now enabled, so you can support Southfront via YouTube now. And if there are many questions, we'll have to prioritize the donations first, and then we'll answer the other questions from the live chat. And yes, this is it. I just want to welcome Brian Kalman and the Saker to our program today. Hey, everyone.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Victor. Good to be back again.
So, we haven't talked for quite some time with you, the Seeker. We had some issues when it came to the live streams, and now we're back, and we're very glad to have the opportunity to talk to you. And recently, you wrote a number of articles on the situation in the Middle East, in particular Syria, and some about Eastern Europe and Ukraine. In particular, what do you think are the current geopolitical trends? Which are the main hot spots, and what could happen in the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2019?
Well, I think that the trend has been continuing for a while. I mean, clearly the empire is looking for confrontation with Russia. Pretty much full spectrum. Wherever they can do something, be it actually just in words or actually in deeds, sometimes ineffective deeds, but they still try to sort of show it is as if Trump and his administration are constantly trying to prove that they're, not friendly towards Russia and that they are basically not missing a single opportunity to make the relationship worse. At this point, from a Russian point of view, I think the Russians have, and that's nothing new here, they've actually given up on the United States quite a while ago. It's just more of the same. I think the biggest difference is right now a very sharp escalation in the Ukraine. And that is, I think, this is linked to the internal politics of the Ukraine, the coming up of the elections, and Poroshenko is in very, very bad shape, as is the rest of the country. So that's happening. And in Syria, I think the main thing is that even though for all practical purposes the government has won the civil war, neither the U.S. nor Turkey are willing to really let that happen. So there's going to be open wounds inside Syria, which will be maintained open and bleeding for political reasons. But right now, if this spring the biggest danger was most definitely in Syria, right now I see the escalation in the Ukraine as probably being even more of a potential source of conflict, tensions, and always against the background of a possibility of actually a war between Russia and the U.S., which could start very fast. So we're in a very dangerous moment right now.
I can totally agree with you on this, on the last part of your introduction. Definitely, the situation in Ukraine is deteriorating every single day, and we're going to discuss it during this live stream, maybe in the second part of the live stream, because we have some questions from the audience, which I'd like you and Brian to comment on. And the first one that we got is from, I think, P.O. Neo. Dear Saker, do you think Syria's S-300 system has deterred Israel from striking the country?
Well, I think there's no doubt about that. But just I want to reiterate something important here. It's not just the S-300. The S-300 is a very capable system, for sure. It's very robust. And the version that was sent to Syria is actually a fairly recent one. So not to underestimate it, but it's not. They're not there in sufficient numbers to single-handedly make such a difference. And secondly, it's not designed to do everything. It's designed to do a certain number of specific things. So it's the S-300s, but it's also the electronic warfare capabilities which were sent to Syria, and the further integration of Russia and Syrian early warning systems, which all of that combined makes it much riskier for the Israelis to undertake airstrikes inside Syria. So they did it. It wasn't very convincing. You look at the chain, there was a strike almost every second day. Now I think we had one, maybe two, I'm not sure. And they were pretty lame. So I think this is Netanyahu proving that, the Israelis were making a lot of statements that they don't care about the S-300s, that's no problem. So they're proving right now by engaging in symbolic strikes that, they still have the upper hand. But if you look at the actual pace of operations, absolutely it did stop them. It doesn't mean it always will. I mean, air defense is a matter of numbers, not only of quality of systems, but literally you need specific numbers to achieve specific results. And there are ways of striking inside Syria that are still perfectly doable for both the U.S. and Israel. So Russia did not really lock, and pose a no-fly zone. She just made the complexity of an attack on Syria much higher, and the potential cost for let's say a serious, a determined attack potentially much higher. So that's where we are. It's not a silver bullet, didn't fix anything, but did it change qualitatively? Oh yes, absolutely.
Brian, what do you think?
Well, I would say that I think Israel announced that they made a strike, their last strike on November 30th, and it was, compared to previous strikes, it was pretty inconsequential and ineffective. I think that it's not really, like the Saker said, the introduction of the S-300 to Syria's air defense capabilities. That's the big thing. It's the further integration with the air defense network of Syria and Russia, all the capabilities, not just air defense missile batteries, electronic warfare and so forth, the integration of that. And I think there were some very frank discussions between the MOD of Russia and the Israeli military, where Russia pretty much laid down that it's not going to allow its service members in Syria to come under threat anymore. What happened with the IL-20, it's very obvious to me and a lot of people that regardless of what Israel says, that it was an accident or that it was Syria's air defense network's fault, they very obviously used the IL-20 as cover, and that was what led to the disaster and the loss of life there on the part of 15 Russian service members. So I think the on the ground, things have changed, obviously, because Israel has not kept up the tempo of attacks that they had in the past. And the few attacks they have attempted, are just have basically been for political means, to help Netanyahu show that Israel's keeping up the fight against Syria, and possibly, like this recent fiasco in Lebanon, is kind of drawing away some of the attention on Netanyahu's own political issues with the investigations into his own political, graft and corruption. So I would agree that the things on the ground, the calculus has definitely changed.
If I may add something here, I think that Brian is absolutely spot on the importance of the discussions between the Israelis and the Russians, because the Israelis, unlike the Americans, I think they understand the Russians much better. Doesn't mean they like them. I don't think they do like them at all, but they understand them. They know the Russian mindset. And think about, let's say the Israelis would conduct a successful, meaningful strike, and it really went well for them. Say they would hit some, high-profile Syrian units or positions or buildings, or if they even engaged, as they threatened for a while, they said, they would engage the S-300s directly, and say they killed Russians or something like that happened. What would be the outcome of a successful Israeli strike? Ask yourself that question. And I think that anybody who knows Russia will immediately say that the Russians would escalate right back. They'll say, oh, it wasn't enough? Because remember when they delivered the S-300s, I don't actually remember the figure of how many they delivered, but they clearly indicated that is the initial batch and they could send in more. So for the Israelis, if you want a tactical success in Syria would result in an operational strategic worsening of the situation, which all the Russians would do is send in more force. And that's open-ended. And the Israelis know that the Russians can't back down. And I think they are not interested in completely alienating Russia, because right now the situation in the Middle East is extremely fluid. The USA is unpredictable and fantastically incompetent. So the Israelis, just like the Saudis, are trying to now engage in a policy which is much more balanced, which, for instance, India has been doing for years, even during the Cold War, playing both sides and trying to get, the best possible deal. That's the same thing Erdogan is doing. And so the Israelis are not interested, unlike the Trump administration. The Israelis have their own issues in Syria and Lebanon, but they're not interested in, as a principle, to worsen the relationship with Russia at all. So I think it's not only that the Russians did deploy meaningful capabilities in Syria, but I think they talked to the Israelis, and the Israelis clearly understood that even the limited capabilities that Russia has in Syria, if they go after that, they'll just increase. And eventually, Russia can lock the Syrian airspace. She definitely has the capabilities to do that. It would just take more hardware. But that's what would happen.
By the way, what do you think are basically how are the Russo-Israeli relationships right now, after the EU-20 incident, after everything that happened, after the S-300? What are basically right now, what is the state of relationships between the two countries? Because we've seen previously that these two countries can negotiate. Netanyahu was on the 9th of May parade, on the victory parade there, to talk with Putin, to show that they can talk and that they can be friends. What do you think are the state of the relations right now?
I think it's bad. I never would speak of friendship between Russia and Israel, even though both parties might use that word. But I think we have to understand that this is a political, this is just, a political statement. The reality is that Russia and Israel have a very complex relationship. It's really multi-layered, but I don't recall the Russians being as angry. They really were angry after the Il-20 was shut down. And I think they realized that the Israelis basically were treating them with contempt. And I think the Israelis really, they committed a major, major blunder. And they were threatened by Russia, very clearly. So this is not a friendship. This is both countries are trying to use each other. The Russians very much need the Israelis because, Israel is one of the two biggest powers in the Middle East. Second, Russia has a very useful function for Israel and Iran because they are talking to both sides. So let's not overlook that. The Iranians and the Israelis have always talked to each other, and it's very important for them to have that party that is not the U.S., that's much more trustworthy, for instance, to keep a contact secret. And secondly, to sort of seek a modus vivendi between Israel and Iran, setting aside all the crazy rhetoric that you hear from the Israelis. They're also in the real world, and they know that they can't afford just fight everybody constantly. So the Israelis need Russia. Russia needs Israel. They don't like each other, but they would like to work with each other. And I think that collaboration has been very severely disrupted and affected by that incident. and the Israelis are probably trying to rebuild bridges, but it's going to take a while. The Russian military was absolutely incensed, and Putin gave them an out. I mean, his first statement was about a tragic event, but when Netanyahu responded with the usual arrogance, that's when the Russians said, well, fine. We're going to use a different language that you will better understand, and I think they have.
I would follow up and add that, I think that the Israelis and the Russians have always had a kind of pragmatic relationship. They've always put their interests first, and they've found middle ground where they can. I would say that when it comes to Israel, I don't think Israel is a friend to anyone, including the United States. They always have their interests at the forefront. And if you look at this tragic incident with the IL-20, you can liken that to some degree to the incident with the USS Liberty, when the Israelis attacked a U.S. surveillance ship during the Johnson administration. And basically, the Israelis and the U.S. administration covered up the incident. But Israel will always keep its own interests first, and it will work with partners, as you would call them, to that end. And they've been able to, in the past, work with Russia, with Putin's administration, on a number of issues of mutual interest in the Middle East. And I think that Putin, like the Saker said, he tried to give Israel a face-saving out in his initial reaction to the IL-20 downing. And, since then, Russia has had to take the steps it has to ensure safety of its service members in Syria and to send a very powerful message to Israel that it's not going to tolerate such occurrences in the future. Mm-hmm. It's strengthened Syria's own air defense network, and it could lock down Syria's airspace. Any concerted attack by the United States and Israel, Russia could respond robustly to, but like the Saker has said, that they just don't have the material numbers in the region to thwart a determined attack. But I don't think that such an incident, a determined attack, is in anyone's interest, Israel's, the United States, at the moment. I think if you look at Israel's involvement in Syria from the start, it's been a strategic failure. If anything, they've put themselves in a less safe position vis-a-vis Iran and Hezbollah since they've been involved in Syria, along with some of the other Gulf states in the United States from the start. So I think that hopefully they can work with Russia and some other partners to de-escalate and improve the situation. If that's going to happen anytime in the next, say, year or two, I don't know. Hopefully it does.
I want to also clarify one thing, because I often sense people are frustrated with Russia's attitude towards Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
that is true. That is absolutely true.
I think it's important to clarify a number of basic facts. The single most important one is that Russia is not Iran. Russia does not have any, I agree with Brian completely, Russian view of Israel is completely pragmatic, seeking her own self-interest. Russia is not interested in helping the Palestinians. Russia does not have a personal, if you want, ideological stake in everything that Israel does. I deeply regret that. I think it's an immoral position, but it is what it is. I mean, my desires don't matter here. The Russian attitude towards Israel is a purely pragmatic one. They will work with them. They would want good relationships with them. It's absolutely not an emotional friendship or any kind of love or anything like that. They're not working hand in hand. People tend to think they simplify that. They think either you're anti-Israeli or you're pro-Israeli. Well, no, not necessarily. Russia has just a very cynical, self-interest in mind point of view about Israel, and that's it. So don't count on Russia to play a key role in the struggle of the Palestinian people, or for that matter, for the sovereignty of Lebanon. It's just not happening. If it's to their advantage, and it is, Russia will support, of course, and Russia does support. Russia is working together with Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Syria. They've had joint operations together. They actually are all coordinating their efforts. But this does not mean that the Russians won't be talking to the Israelis, and if the Israelis give the Russians an advantageous offer, the Russians will take it. It's not Iran that has a profound... Iran's position on this entire conflict is a moral, religious, and ethical one. Not so in the case of Russia. It's purely pragmatic self-interest.
And Saker, there are a few questions here. Again, from P.O. Neo, one of them is also, what do you think? When do you think the Syrian Arab Army will carry out an offensive to liberate the rest of Hama, Idlib, Latakia, and Aleppo from foreign-backed militia?
Well, I don't know, is the simple answer. And the reason for that is that this is not as much a political decision, a military decision, it is a political one. I mean, they were poised to do it up north. They decided to negotiate. They got a deal going. If the Syrians want to, liberate every single square inch of their territory, they're going to have the Turks and the Americans go absolutely crazy. So they don't want that. So I think that's countries like the U.S. and Turkey are sort of freezing the conflict. And I don't see any reason to believe that things are going to get easier for the Syrians politically in the foreseeable future. It's exactly the same thing again. As I said, what do the Israelis achieve if they have a successful attack? Well, same here. If the Syrians successfully attack, say, the northern regions of Syria, all it will do is create an opposing reaction from Turkey. And the same thing for the United States, which are clearly not willing to give up Syria yet. So I think that is what paralyzes the Syrian government much more than purely military considerations.
I would totally agree there. I mean, it's a foregone conclusion militarily. Syria could take Idlib. There's political ramifications that are much more important there. Turkey and the United States position in Syria. It's interesting, the more that the conflict has been frozen between the SAA and the aligned groups in Idlib, the more that it has exacerbated some problems between Turkey and the U.S. proxies in northern and northeastern Syria. We're seeing that now with Erdogan announcing that he's going to have another military operation against the U.S. aligned proxies east of the Euphrates and in northern Syria, and that Russia and the Syrian government can do well to just wait it out and let those tensions increase between supposed NATO allies and see how that plays out. I mean, Idlib's a foregone conclusion eventually, militarily.
Saker, sorry for interrupting here. Yes, there is a question from the audience, from the live chat, which is, it comes from Amaranth Flower, and the question is, what is the pragmatic self-interest? Can we define that? It's in the case of the Russia, which we talked about.
It's a good and it's a trick question because, of course, if you're a person moved by ethical considerations, you include these considerations in your pragmatic self-interest. What I meant by that is that basically Russia does not have a moral stake, a principled position on the Palestinian conflict, other than the UN resolution. So, Russia supported, a two-state solution. Russia, wants Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. But that's basically because it's international law. But the truth is that when I speak of pragmatic self-interest, what I meant by that is basically where you care about yourself and your own positions, and you don't care about the positions of, for instance, the Palestinian people. It's just not a priority for Russia, which I deplore, but it's a fact. That's what I meant by pragmatic self-interest. Is it good for Russia is the only question.
So there is a question again from the audience. Just wanted to go through it, and Symmetric has asked us, will we talk about the current situation with Turkey invading northern Syria and the U.S. involvement? Guys, both of you, what do you think about the Turkish involvement? And it's been quiet, yet for the last days we've been hearing about reports about strikes in northern Iraq, actually. And what do you think is going to be the position of Erdogan in the near future?
Well, first of all, any civil war or regional war, the outcome has to be supported by the regional main powers. Let's take, for instance, Afghanistan. I don't think, that's a perfect example. The U.S. cannot impose a solution on Afghanistan which Iran and Pakistan and all the other regional countries, including Russia, don't support. And the same thing is happening in Syria. I mean, if the Turks or the Iranians don't approve of it, it's just not going to happen. They can't unilaterally force something, but they can deny it to somebody else unless their interests are taken into consideration. And I think the problem is that Turkey is playing a complicated game of trying to balance, the Russia and the U.S. Russia has a pretty clear agenda in Syria, but not the United States. I think there is a complete absence of any kind of identifiable foreign policy in the U.S., not only in Syria, but generally. The U.S. basically does not have a foreign policy. I've said that many times. I mean, the sole function of the State Department is issuing ultimatums and threats and listing people, sanctions and listing them for supporting terrorism. That's nonsense. That's not, diplomacy. And I don't think the United States has a concept of what they want. I think there's a CIA foreign policy, a DOD foreign policy, a State Department foreign policy, probably one of the National Security Council versus somebody else. And all of them, because there's no clear leader in the United States, because Trump is just a puppet. And it was the same situation, by the way, with Obama. It began with him. Obama was extremely weak. And when that happens, you have the various agencies stepping in and starting to go on their own independent sort of quest for whatever their agenda is. So Turkey does not even know really what the U.S. wants. The U.S. has zigzagged so many times, and the plans for the U.S. and creating some kind of Kurdistan inside Syria have been zigzagging massively. So on one hand, you have the United States, which doesn't have a foreign policy at all. You have Russia, which has a kind of a contradictory one. It's a checkered record because, as I often like to mention, Russia, there is a strong unitary, power in the Kremlin ability. Even if the Turks and the Iranians fully agree on some kind of solution in Syria, as long as the Israelis want to disrupt it, or the U.S. for that matter, they can. So that's why we're sort of stuck, because right now the parties there is no compromise, that's acceptable to all the main parties.
I would add that Turkey obviously has a vested interest in what's going on in Syria, at least in northern Syria, and it comes down to the Kurdish issue, and has a huge influence on their own country. You can see even before the Syrian conflict started, Turkish incursions into Iraq for the same reason. The United States, I don't think they have a real idea of what they want in Syria anymore, seeing as their initial proxy war failed. It comes down to what they don't want. And I think they don't want a unified Syria that's aligned with Iraq and Iran.
Correct.
And they definitely do not want that possibility where Russia has increased influence. And that comes down to, political power and also the flow of resources in that area from that part of the world to Europe. And, there's a lot of issues there that come down to economics and the flow of energy resources. So the United States position now is they're just basically the monkey wrench that's thrown into any possible solving of the problem in Syria, an end to the conflict. They want to be there to make sure that reconciliation, that end, doesn't happen at least for this foreseeable future. It's kind of funny, Turkey and Russia have had an adversarial, or at least a competitive relationship for centuries. And Turkey is kind of a spoiler as well as Israel in this conflict between Syria and Russia and the United States, or if you want to look at also Syria, Russia, and Iran and the United States. Although I would agree with the Saker that Russia is only involved for its own pragmatic ends. It's looking out for its own interests, and it wants a stability in the region, where Iran has different interests. It's Israel and Turkey both are kind of spoilers here, and I think Erdogan's announcements recently in another offensive in the area, it must really drive the White House crazy. Trump is a non-issue. I mean, he's totally been put in a box by the deep state, and if you look at the people that he's brought into positions of power, all the neocons, all the deep state operatives, Trump is a non-issue. He's irrelevant, really. If it didn't show that he has no understanding of geopolitical or geostrategic issuing and military issues, it's obvious that he doesn't. And but he's really not pulling the strings when it comes to that.
Agreed.
Well, there is actually a question from the audience about it, and who actually rules the foreign policy of the U.S. besides Trump's Twitter?
If I just may also I'll answer that in a second, but I just want to add one more thing, is that you have to see that the United States has been profoundly humiliated by Russia and Syria. I mean, CENTCOM, NATO, the U.S. have huge capabilities in the Middle East. I mean, immense. And the more they intervened to, crush terrorism, the more terrorism was doing great and, increasing in size, etc. And when the Russians came in, remember Obama was promising body bags and a complete failure. With a tiny, tiny, tiny force, really the force is I always stress that, is really small what the Russians have in Syria. They turned the tide of the war. So the United States are profoundly humiliated. And secondly, in the Ukraine, Russia just is not caving in on anything. As a result, I think it's crucial to understand that the U.S. position is never allow Russia to have a success, even if it's irrelevant for us. If Russia was to propose something, for some small island in the middle of the Pacific that nobody cares about, if it's a Russian solution, the Americans will try to frustrate it and sabotage it. And that is also a reflection of U.S. capabilities, because it's much harder. You need much more power to impose a solution than to disrupt one. And while the United States does not have the military means to, successfully threaten North Korea or Iran, or even much less so China or Russia, they do have the means to sabotage and create local mayhem. So that's what they're doing out of spite and being humiliated. For them, it's a zero-sum game. It's basically do anything possible to deny Russia whatever it is that she could try to achieve. That's not much of a foreign policy, I agree, but that's how low they have sunk right now. And to answer the question of who rules the United States, the way I see it, think of a mathematical model with vectors. As I mentioned, there are lots of entities in the United States that have their own vector, and depending on their power, their vector is more or less has more or less influence. I mean, the oil lobby, the weapons lobby, the neocons, the Zionists, the Israel lobby, but also the people who have a stake in Europe and the Ukraine and the Pacific. All of these forces, because there's such weakness at the top, basically there's nobody in the White House for practical purposes. They all have their own policy, and what results is a sum vector. And that's what we think of as being the U.S. foreign policy. But it's just a sum vector. It doesn't really exist. That's why it can be completely incoherent. That's why you can have, DOD protecting the Kurds and the CIA wanting them to be bombed. I mean, or the other way around. It's a policy which basically is completely schizophrenic because it's not centralized, because there's never has been. The U.S. has lost the ability, to understand the world it operates in just due to the low quality of the people in charge. I mean, compare that absolute idiot Pompeo with a guy like what was his name? Who was under Bush Senior? He was DOD. Ministry of. At Foggy Bottom. Who was it? Now I have a blank now. James Baker. Sorry. Compare the quality of a diplomat like Baker with a pathetic individual like Pompeo, who all he does is go out and spew some kind of hot air. So there's a loss of competent people. I won't even go to the Nikki Haley, now replaced with that other idiot. I mean, we're talking about basically people. I mean, Putin said it. It's hard to deal with people who confuse Australia and Austria, and that's what you have in the U.S. And on top of that, you have a very weak president, which is basically irrelevant. It's sort of the chicken. You cut off the head of the chicken runs around left and right. That's what the U.S. does. The problem is that chicken is armed with nuclear weapons. That's the scary part.
Well, talking about being humiliated, isn't that the reason of the rumors about the hundreds of killed Russian PMCs, then repeated by Trump, Pompeo, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what it is.
Well, I would add that I think that the Saker's analogy of vectors is very spot on. It's so fragmented, the establishment, the power system in the United States, the government. I mean, if you just look at U.S. history, the Constitution of the United States has been so changed and altered over the centuries from what it was originally supposed to be that it's totally changed the power structure in Washington. Not to mention all the corruption, the introduction of the military-industrial complex at the end of World War II. So there's so many different fragmented interests that control the United States. Whether you just look at the bureaucracy within the executive branch and how that interacts with the legislature, which has had its power reduced, and even if you look at the legislature, it's part of the federal government too. The states have had their own power reduced so much since at least the turn of the century of the 1900s, when you had a number of constitutional amendments that basically took a lot of power away from the states. The Federal Reserve Act, where also senators not being selected by state legislatures. You have the growth of power of the intelligence elements of the government. The United States, has 17 disclosed intelligence operations of the NSA, the CIA. Yeah. It's becoming even more fragmented as time goes on, and you've seen it in Syria, like the Saker said, where the DOD has its interest, the CIA has its interest, the White House has its interest, and they don't coalesce. They don't coincide, and it's become very obvious over the past few years. And we do have a very, very weak president in office. Obama was a weak president. Trump is, without a doubt, a weaker president because...
do you really think so?
I think without a doubt. I mean, without a doubt. At least...
Isn't he just put in a very difficult and maybe the most difficult situation of any other U.S. president by that time?
I think Trump has no allies within his own administration, really. And definitely not in the executive branch.
Then how does he keep power if he has zero allies? He definitely should have some if he's still in power.
He was elected and he's a puppet, and they're trying every way they can to get rid of him. So he's a placeholder president right now. I think he has very, very little power when it comes to working within the government itself. He might have power with the people, and I think he needs to realize that. In a lot of ways, Putin realized that a long time ago, that his power was it lied in his support from the people, and Trump. Absolutely. Trump got the support of at least half the country, if you think about it in simple terms, and that's where his power lies, which is why he's still on Twitter. I wish he would be a little bit more eloquent in some of his tweets, but the man is who he is. But he's a very weak president.
I completely agree with that, and I want to illustrate that by a crucial, I think, event, which is look how fast he gave up on Flynn. Flynn is not necessarily my hero, and Bannon is most definitely not my hero, but these guys were the two strong personalities that were allies and Trump basically had those two guys as the trusted base that he could, that got him into the White House, and he dumped them both. Trump I think his main problem is that he's a profoundly dishonorable person who doesn't stand up for the people who stick their neck out for him. And contrast that with Putin, whose reputation is that he's too loyal to the people that worked with him. And sometimes he is. I agree with that. I mean, you could have another extreme. But the point is that if you don't stand up the people who back you, you send a very bad message and everybody runs. And just ask yourself the question, if Trump asked you to help him, would you stick your head out for a guy like him? I certainly wouldn't. And that's the problem, is that he got the neocons very rapidly eliminated Flynn, which I think was the single most powerful person in his original cabinet. Pardon me?
I can agree on this one about General Flynn.
And then Bannon, who was sort of his ideological base. And once he did that, it was a free-for-all. And now, he's basically rotating people who get frustrated with him. Look at the way he turned against Tillerson recently, saying that he's, lazy.
Yeah.
That's just ugly. I mean, come on. I mean, Tillerson is not a hero of mine either, but he certainly wasn't the worst in there. But Trump is unable, he's clearly completely unable to cultivate, some kind of power base that he can rely upon. And that makes him, I think, weaker than Obama. Obama at least had people who were backing him. Trump doesn't. And it's all entirely his in my opinion, it's entirely his fault.
Saker, do you want to turn the topic into what's going on in Ukraine? Because
Sure.
I see that the time is going on right now, or to just keep it on the Syrian topic. It's all up to you. This is the interview with you. I mean, this live stream is more or less about you. So,
what are the questions? Let's see what the people in the chat
we had
want.
a bit more questions about what's going on. Are the Syrians and the Russians are going to put the S-300s in Deir ez-Zor to defend from possible U.S. strikes? Or we can just turn it to Ukraine, the Kerch incident, and the escalation, the possible escalation in the Donbas region.
Let's look at that then.
Let's look at the Donbas region.
I would agree.
Okay.
It's an important issue.
So, we had a question here. So, and I think that it's going to be very interesting for all of you. Turning into Ukraine, who manages the U.S. attitude towards Ukraine now? It was the Biden clan during the Obama administration, but who does that right now? Who is the center of attention right now? And what are the interests of the U.S. right now there?
Well, the most visible person is Payet, for sure. But again, this is the same situation. I'm not convinced that there's a single U.S. policy for the Ukraine either. What does the U.S. really want? I don't think there's a clear plan at all. So I think we're having exactly the same situation, a bizarre sum vector, which basically, what it has, anti-Russia for sure, back the regime in power no matter what they do. I mean, literally, Putin was absolutely correct when he said, they can eat babies and they would get the Western support. It's true. It's absolutely true. No matter how ridiculous, whatever, blame everything on Russia. Yes, that's a consensus position, and support the regime in Kiev no matter what. That's the sort of the superficial position. Deep down, I think they're thinking of, and correctly, of getting rid of Poroshenko eventually. I think they would be much happier with Tymoshenko as the U.S., Gauleiter, or, whatever you want to call them, special.
I think she'll be way more extreme than Poroshenko.
In what way?
Well, I think she'll be even more aggressive than Poroshenko.
I don't think so. I think she has a rhetoric, but she is very pragmatic. Don't listen to what she says. I know that she can say all sorts of dumb things. She even, when the Crimean liberation happened, she was saying that they should be nuked. I mean, she does say things like that. But look, she got a deal going with Putin. At least she's smart. I think Poroshenko is an idiot and an alcoholic. I don't think he's an extremely weak guy. And around him, it's scary. I mean, you look at people like Parubi or Turchinov.
Or, when you see Turchinov and you were like, are these really the people that are running a country?
Yes, it's absolutely. It blows all of them. I mean, it's just a complete freak show. Whereas I think that she, being much smarter, would at least, surround herself with some people that, can get things done, and she would probably try to negotiate some kind of deal with the U.S. that you would exchange, support for compliance. But whatever it is the case, I think Poroshenko is just totally used now, and I think the West is becoming tired of having, they all supported the Ukraine over the Kerch incident, but I don't think there's anybody out there who seriously believe actually that Russia prevented anybody from exercising their legal rights or violated international law, or that the Yukis were just trying to innocently pass. I don't think anybody believes in that nonsense.
Well, surely some crazy guys are thinking about it. By the way, did you see the news about the Ukrainian military using some Nazi insignias?
Yes.
Did you see all of that? I mean, it was...
Yeah, but there's nothing new. It's been going on for years.
Definitely nothing new there.
Nothing new here.
It's been going on from the start. I mean, that's one of the strange bedfellows that the United States allied itself with in overthrowing the democratically elected government in the Ukraine. It's like the Saker says, you look at U.S. foreign policy in the Ukraine, it was almost like the United States went in and said, okay, let's just upset the apple cart and see what falls out.
Yeah.
They didn't really have an overarching strategic plan there, and they made alliances with the likes of Poroshenko and other oligarchs and a number of far right fascist neo-Nazi groups, and so these images that come out of soldiers in the Ukrainian army or the National Guard that have the Black Sun or the Death's Head SS runes and Totenkopf Death's Head patches. It's been going on from the start. It shouldn't surprise anyone.
Recently I was listening to a conversation among Russian analysts, and one guy who's from the eastern Ukraine, his theory was that it was very deliberate, actually, because here's what he said, and I just want to paraphrase it because I think it's a very, it's a good hypothesis, is that from the beginning the U.S. plan was to trigger a civil war. And that's why they told the locals to introduce those ridiculous language laws that they passed, and that's the Bandera thing and all these Nazi symbols, because even though in the West people don't want to believe that they're neo-Nazis there, in the eastern Ukraine they all realize what's going on, and the purpose was to trigger a civil war in order to create instability on the Russian border. Because if you look originally, I always give that example, and I think it's very, very telling. Look at early images of protests in the Donbass or even in Crimea, but particularly the Donbass. Crimea is a little bit more complicated. People were coming out and demonstrating with Ukrainian flags, not Russian flags. The Russian flags appeared en masse when Turchinov decided to start his little anti-terrorist war. That's when they send in the tanks and start basically shooting and killing people. That's when there was a really strong reaction. So if the plan was to trigger a civil war, putting forward all these Nazis made perfectly good sense.
And by the way, having all of this in mind, there's a question from, I can't really, Reptilis Pantoso. He'll see his question anyway. Can you share your thoughts about what NATO will do if Poroshenko starts a conflict?
Well, my opinion is that NATO will not get militarily involved directly. I don't think the Ukraine is worth it for anybody. I mean, there was some interest, I think was definitely, not some, most definitely interest. NATO and the Empire wanted Crimea. Mm-hmm. That is objectively, strategically, an immensely important landmark. But now that this is gone, their dream is always the same one, to get the Russians to intervene militarily overtly, not in fiction, but actually to do it. Once that happens, NATO and the West got what they wanted, which is the proof, finally, that the Russians are aggressive, that they don't accept the outcome of the Cold War, that they want to redraw the maps of Europe, that they're imperialist, that all that stuff will sort of get a proof if the Russians can be forced to intervene overtly. That's why the Russians are not intervening overtly and limited to their assistance to covert support. That's the big question. But once, you have to understand that, first of all, let's take those weapon shipments to the Ukraine. The Ukraine is flush with weapons. They don't need any weapons from the West. They have a lot of them. And the goal is not to somehow, arm the Ukrainians to be able to resist the Russian military. This is laughable. It's sort of similar to the situation of the Iraqi military versus the U.S. and CENTCOM during the first Gulf War. It would be a turkey shoot if that happens. And NATO knows that, and there's no amount of there's nothing NATO could really do to prevent the Russians from smashing the Ukrainian military if it came to that. But the point is to force them to do it overtly. That's what they want.
I would agree with the Saker there. It's more comes down to propaganda and politics there with NATO. And if Russia were to respond, in the Ukraine overtly, they can use that as propaganda that, this is why NATO exists. This is why you have to keep dumping billions of dollars into the NATO, which is part of the military-industrial complex. There's just so much money wrapped up in NATO. We've talked about this many times. To bring that overtly out there, that would be in their interest. I mean, if you look at what happened in the Kerch Strait incident, this Ukrainian flotilla, 2 gunboats and a tugboat. I mean, they obviously were not meaning to win any naval engagement.
Absolutely.
They were trying to force a transit, basically stating that
Yes.
they do not recognize Russia's sovereignty over the area. They were trying to create an international incident, which would once again put Russia propaganda-wise in a bad light, making Russia respond. I mean, I think if you look at what happened in the incident and how the Russian Coast Guard responded over a 2-hour incident, they chased these boats out. They tried to give them the option of retreating out of Russian territorial waters and waiting to gain proper entry into the area to transit, or to retreat out of Russian territorial waters. They chased these boats for, I think it was about 2 hours. And they finally had to use force. They rammed the tugboat, and they also had to fire on the 2 gunboats to get them under control. Thank God nobody was killed. There was some minor injuries, but I think that in the end, the Russian Coast Guard used a lot of restraint, because they knew that they didn't want this huge international incident. And I had to say that, by the way, they didn't know if that tugboat or those gunboats were loaded with explosives and were going to possibly try to, attack the bridge that was built, which, you even have Western journalists calling for that bridge to be blown up right after it was inaugurated. So I think they actually responded very level-headedly to this incident, and it was used by Poroshenko to internally, politically, he tried to gain martial law for a number of months with this election coming up. And if you looked at the regions where martial law was actually imposed, it was in all the regions where he would not have been, the candidate of choice. So, that was obviously done for his own internal political reasons. So, there's with Poroshenko, I think the United States would throw him under the bus in a heartbeat if some other oligarch looked a little bit more favorable to them. So,
right now, he doesn't have a single competent person anywhere near him. I mean, Klimkin is another example of an absolute disaster. I mean, we're talking about people who are borderline retard. I mean, this is really frightening. That's why I do think that, coming back to Tymoshenko, she would be able to form a better team. But what Brian says about this little naval operation, it's exactly it. I think the calculation was that the Russians would open fire on them, which they had the legal right to do, by the way, easily.
Yes, absolutely.
By the way, and then it would have been, aha, look at them. Look what the Russians do. They killed, totally innocent. They were, I think, deeply frustrated when the Russians did not use force.
Well, they were going back and forth for 12 hours. It wasn't only 2
I
or
mean,
3 hours. It was going back and forth for almost 12 hours.
You know,
I agree that.
I always go ahead.
I agree. I mean, it's a very clear cut what happened in the Kerch Strait. I mean, like any other strait or a major port where you have a lot of traffic, you know, any vessel from anywhere that's coming into that area has to report, you know, at least 72 hours ahead of time to vessel traffic service, to the port authority, to the Coast Guard, that they aim to transit that area. If they're not calling the port, you'd also have to contact customs and, you know, provide a manifest and a crew list and, you know, a list of weapons stores on the vessel prior to transiting or calling the port. It's like this in any other port in the world. So I mean, any vessel has to give prior notice, and, you know, so they're naval vessels, so they have this innocent passage. They can basically transit territorial waters if they give prior notice to the sovereign state innocently, even though they're a warship. Well, you know, their claim to innocent passage went out the door as soon as they brandished their weapons on the ships, after they were notified by the Coast Guard of Russia that they hadn't given proper prior notification of transit. So, you know, on a legal basis alone, the Ukrainian naval vessels were in, you know, violation of local Russian laws as well as international laws. So, I mean, that's just a simple fact.
And I would add, look, the fact that they actually closed the portion under the bridge by using a cargo ship. It's not because that's the only way they could have done it. Russia can sink the entire, I can't even call it a fleet, but the vessels that the Ukraine currently has in the Black Sea, Russia can sink every one of them within minutes. The reason why they put that cargo ship is because they don't want to use force and they don't want to shoot at people. It's very, very typical, and it's completely transferable to the Donbass. We have exactly the same dynamic.
Seeker, having all of this in mind, do you think that we can expect a bigger escalation in the near future in the Donbass region? And what could happen?
We've been on the edge of a major escalation for so long it almost becomes, you know, a boring thing to say. I would say that things are probably worse now than they were in the past. There were false alarms in the past. I think Putin's threat made last summer that if the Ukrainians decided to attack, it would have severe consequences for Ukrainian statehood, is probably what stopped the Ukrainians at that moment during the summer. But right now, I mean, if you look at and I think it's very important to listen to the Ukrainian propaganda, because you listen to the ideology of your opponent to understand how he thinks and what he acts. And there's such a war fever right now in the Ukraine. It's insane. I mean, it's as if they were completely actually at war. That's the kind of rhetoric they have. And certainly Poroshenko is not winning any elections that are going to be even a little bit credible. I mean, unless he does something truly ridiculous, he's not going to win. So he is in a very bad situation. So I would say, yeah, the risks are even worse than they were in the past. But we were at the edge of a conflict for years now. And the shape of that conflict, well, that's simple. That's an incident of some kind, followed by Ukrainian liberation, as they would put, of the Donbass. And then the only question is, can the Novorossians, the DNR and LNR, can they together, do they have enough to stop the Ukrainian attack? Their big problem is they have no strategic depth. Mm-hmm. So they have to forward deploy, and that's risky and dangerous, particularly when there's a lot of firepower on the other side and numbers, both of which the Ukrainians have an advantage here. So the big issue is that once they launched their last two times, they were very successful, the Novorossians. Russia did not have to intervene. And I hope that this what happens the next time around again, is that the Novorossians, and I think it's probably what's going to happen.
Do you think it's inevitable?
An attack?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say inevitable, but I would be extremely surprised and happy if there was a way of avoiding one, which I don't see right now, unless there's a regime change in Kiev, and I don't see that happening. So I would say it's practically inevitable. Yes.
And we have a question with donation from John. Thank you for your donation. And he has a question. Has there been any response to the assassination of Givi and the other of his comrades? And who is blowing up the ammo depots there? Do you have any information?
Well, yeah, he's probably referring to the ammo depots in the Nazi-occupied Ukraine, not in Novorossiysk. I don't think it's sabotage. I think they're basically trying to hide the fact that they were. I think it's a maneuver to conceal the fact that they're smuggling weapons to everybody, including the Novorossians, by the way, and also abroad. So once there's a risk, that the stocks might be checked, you just blow it up. Also, negligence. The Ukraine is in terrible shape, so in terms of work discipline, etc., it's horrible. So I think it's probably a mixture of these two things. I don't think it was sabotage. As for the murders of the various leaders of Novorossiysk, no, there hasn't been, and I don't think there's a good option to retaliate. I mean, what would be a good option? To start engaging in attacks against individuals inside, in Kiev or elsewhere? I don't think it's a good option. So I think they're waiting for their time to finally be able to fight openly.
And I have a question here, and that's something that nobody is really discussing. What's going on internally in DPR and LPR after Zakharchenko was assassinated, basically? After Zakharchenko was killed, we saw that basically there was a coup d'etat in DPR. After 2 days after his death, there was basically a coup d'etat there that happened. So what's going on right now there? What's the internal situation? Do we have even any information on the state there?
I think that's a question you should ask of somebody who has at least been there recently or is there currently. Because my understanding of the situation is very fluid, and there are different clans fighting each other. Sadly, but there's no way all these assassination attempts could have been successful without accomplices inside the NRLNR. So I think the situation there is very fluid and unstable. But I think going further than that, I would rather you ask the question to somebody who can give you, first-hand knowledge. I would be just paraphrasing what my contacts there tell me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I could only add that, obviously the situation in the DPR and the LPR is that it's very fragmented as far as leadership. The fact that these well-known leaders of a number of military units, as well as the head of state and the DPR, their assassinations has shown how fragmented the leadership is. And, like Andre, like the Saker said, there's obviously a lot of corruption. These acts of assassination couldn't have happened without some sort of inside help or, moles within the DPR and the LPR. It also shows how weak the security is defending these people in positions of leadership in these republics, which, I don't know if it's going to change here in the future, but, from the assassination of the leader of the Ghost Brigade all the way to Motorola and Givi and then to Zakharchenko happened over more than a year. So they obviously haven't really learned much when it came to, providing proper operational security.
Yeah. And I was pretty harshly criticized for raising that issue of safety after the murder, I think it was, of Mozgovoy. And since what has happened, we've lost Givi and we lost Zakharchenko. So,
and we've lost Motorola, and we've lost so many others.
It's a disgrace. And all I can say is that I personally wish that the Russians were much more involved directly to restore security to these republics. Clearly, they haven't done so, and they're acting indirectly only.
So we're at the 70-minute mark.
Situation.
We're on the 70-minute mark. Do you want to have, let's say, one or maybe like one more question, and then
I can stay a little longer. That's fine.
Yeah, because it's going to be interesting for the people. So we have a similar question from Vukan Simic, who asked if Poroshenko could provoke a war with Russia in order to stay in power. But I think that we've already discussed that. But let's say that we put ourselves in the scenario that those provocations turn into a war. What can actually happen during that type of war? We know that the territory of DPR and LPR is not stable, it's not vast, and that Ukraine has way more firepower. Could they easily win such a war? And what will be your thoughts on the reaction of Russia then?
I don't think they can win easily. Again, without having direct knowledge, which I do not have right now, of the readiness of the Ukrainian and Novorussia forces, I can only make an educated guess. But I think that they're approaching, basically they're counting on advantage in numbers and firepower, but that doesn't carry the day, though. Morale is still crucial, particularly with that kind of war. And the Novorussians will be defending their own neighborhoods, families, schools, friends, etc. And I think they have been reorganized, as far as I know, successfully so. They're capable, unlike what happened a couple of years ago. I believe that the Novorussians are capable of operational level counterattacks, which would put potentially the Ukrainians at great risk if they get caught yet again. And this time around, you could see, because the first time around, people always say it was a mistake not to take Mariupol. Mm-hmm. My sense is that it was very easy to cut off any force entering Mariupol from the rest of Novorussia. There was a risk, actually, of having a cauldron with the Novorussian forces caught in there. I think that's one of the main reasons why they were told not to go further and pull back. But this time around, they're much more capable of coordinating higher level operations, which means that there's a possibility of a very successful counterattack. And imagine what would happen if the Russians got involved overtly. It would be primarily by strikes, air and artillery and missile strikes, which means the Ukrainians would be very rapidly disorganized, and the Russians could also blind them by electronic warfare by suppressing their reconnaissance capabilities, at which point the counter attack capabilities of DNR, LNR would be even much more real, and that could turn into a disaster. I think that's why the Ukrainians are so afraid. We've been on the edge of that attack, but they're they were twice punished very severely when they tried that. So I think they're afraid of actually, losing everything if they do that. So I think they're hesitating.
Sorry, Brian, for interrupting you, but people and I'm going to give you the floor for both of you on the last question. People in the live chat are raising the question about a possible U.S.-Russia conflict, and most likely in Eastern Europe, especially concerned about the INF Treaty withdrawal by Washington. Isn't that endangering the entire Europe, because it will basically turn into a battleground?
Well, my take on that is it's already turned into a battleground. That mistake already happened when NATO was pushed east. That put everybody at severe risk. After that, it's just more of the same. On the specific treaty, I think it is important politically for Russia, but from a military point of view, that treaty was much more to the advantage of the United States. And I think they're doing a very stupid thing by scrapping it, because it will actually militarily benefit Russia, but will it increase the bullseye that's painted on Europe, will it get bigger? Oh, yes, absolutely. And if let's see, first of all, if the U.S. does deploy intermediate range missiles, they might not even do that. But if they do, will they all become targets? Yes, they will. And the closer you are to the Russian border, the more firepower can potentially hit you. It's not a good idea to forward deploy, which is what NATO has been doing all these years. Militarily, it's absurd. It's purely political body language to send a message, as they like to say. But it's self-defeating militarily.
Well, I couldn't agree more with pretty much everything the Saker said there. As far as the INF Treaty and the United States pulling out, it was definitely always to the benefit of the United States, that treaty, and not Russia. It basically limited Russia in having short-range or intermediate-range cruise missiles, land-based. It didn't do anything to weaken the U.S. position in having those same missiles based on its huge Navy or air assets. So it was obviously always to the detriment of Russia, that treaty. So, it doesn't really hurt Russia if they're freed to deploy short-range and intermediate-range missiles on land, on their borders. Because NATO's getting closer and closer and closer to Russia. It's not the other way around, as much as the Western media likes to say that. Does that put Eastern Europe and parts of Western Europe in the crosshairs as far as where Russia would have to strike in case of a future conflict? Of course. And maybe that'll make some European countries wake up and break out of this state of being vassals to the United States. Maybe that'll be a good thing if it happens before there's a potential conflict. That might actually have a good influence. A lot of people have said, that the United States moving out of the INF Treaty has more to do with advances in missile technology and fielding intermediate and short-range missiles on the part of China. There might be some truth to that. But, why doesn't the United States approach China about joining the INF Treaty or coming up with a bilateral treaty with China?
Absolutely.
But I think the United States, the White House, the administration, the Trump administration, or if you look at the past two administrations, they don't really have the diplomatic desire or even the clout to do that. If you look at how Trump's administration has approached any issue with China, whether it's the South China Sea crisis or it's North Korea or it's economics, this trade war, they haven't actually engaged in real viable diplomacy. They've just basically threatened China. And it's a very stupid thing to try to threaten the largest economy in the world. It's already in real terms past the United States, really. And that's the only way that the United States seems to be able to approach an issue. Is there a potential for a conflict in Europe with the United States once again pulling out of another arms treaty? Of course there is. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, but I think there's other issues at play. But I think if the United States pushes too far in Europe with NATO, if there is a conflict, it's Russia's already made it very clear that if it escalates to a certain point, it becomes a nuclear war, and then nobody wins from that.
I would add that look what happened in the Koreas is very interesting. When Trump got completely crazy with his threats against North Korea, the South Koreans actually got involved directly. And they started talking directly to the North. So my hope is that eventually with time, we're going to have countries in Europe going, you know what, that's our future. Forget the U.S. We need to talk and we need to avoid that. So the U.S., it's one thing to withdraw from the INF Treaty. It's quite another to actually deploy missiles in Europe. So let's see if that actually really happens. It's not a done deal.
Okay, and having all of this in mind, we'll go to the conclusion of this live stream because we've been live for more than 75 minutes now. And Seeker, just want to have your last thoughts on the live stream, and if there's anything that you'd like to tell our audience. I would strongly recommend to follow everything that you've been posting and writing on the Seeker.is. And yes, what would you say to our audience?
I would encourage everybody with your friends, your social media, and everything you can, raise the issue of the risk of war. I think Professor Stephen Cohen is absolutely correct when he says that the risks right now are bigger than during the Cold War. I think it's even worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what we need to do is constantly remind people that we are really in an extremely dangerous situation, and that kind of war would have devastating consequences. So everything else should come second. This should trump everybody's concern. There should be a determined effort made by all the responsible countries to make a nuclear war or even a conventional major war impossible, unthinkable, by confidence-building measures, by diplomacy, by restoring sanity. Right now, there's been this amok run of the Trump administration threatening everybody worldwide. That cannot continue, because if that continues, down the road, we're looking at a war. So our only hope is to somehow gather enough people, the concerns, to say, no, we don't want that. Stop it. Do everything you can to repeat over and over and over again, no, it's not safe. We are at the edge of a war. That's, I think, what I would ask everybody in the audience. Do whatever you can to raise that topic.
I would agree with
Brian,
the Saker. You know, if you look at the Saker's blog and his posting of the 2018 Man of the Year award, it went to the American Dissident. Stephen Cohen being one of the more vocal ones. I think we all have to be dissidents when it comes to trying to prevent escalation of these conflicts. I mean, we're living in some pretty dangerous times now. And like Stephen Cohen says, you know, there was never any time during the Cold War where an American president couldn't talk to his counterpart in Russia. You know,
absolutely.
I mean, if you look at the Kerch Strait incident, it only took a minor incident for Trump to not meet with Putin at the summit. You know, that's all it took. You know, it took the shoot down of a U-2 spy plane over Soviet territory to stop the summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. But they spoke on a regular basis. I mean, we're at a point now where the U.S. president can't even speak to the Russian president. It's not allowed. And that's really a dangerous development, especially when you look at how close we are to having a conflict either in the Middle East or over Ukraine or at another crisis point. You know, we're living in some really possibly dangerous times. So I would agree with the Saker. Yeah, you educate yourself, you speak the truth, you know, talk to your friends, your family. You if you want to engage in a blog or you know, keep visiting alternative media where you're actually going to get a more clear version of events, a more truthful version of events. You know, you just have to keep fighting, keep up the dialogue, keep telling the truth, and you know. Hopefully, things will get better as we approach this new year. But you know, it's hard to say. It's we have a lot of. Go ahead, Andre.
I want to add one more thing. Please support South Front financially. No, let me explain why it's crucial. South Front, besides being good people, and I will vouch for that, and they're doing. First of all, their product is absolutely unique. There is no number two in that. They are alone in doing the kind of video reports that they do. And secondly, I use them every day on my blog. They're providing an absolutely priceless quality of information, and they have a very high rating. I mean, they get a lot of visitors. I think over twice than what my blog gets. But as soon as you go under the president, we'll tell you what's the popularity of that is. We cannot allow that operation to stop. We absolutely need South Front. It's crucial. So I ask all of my supporters and everybody who's listening, please donate to South Front. They didn't ask me to say that, by the way. I asked you to do it because I think they're crucial for our common struggle. So that will be my conclusion here today.
So then I will not ask anyone to donate. The Saker has already done that. And the last words from my point, just want to thank both of you guys for joining us today and having this nice discussion, having this friendly approach every single time when we talk to each other, and just being more knowledgeable and getting more knowledge out of both of you, which is great. It was absolutely perfect for me. I hope that it was knowledgeable and it was helpful for our audience. And also, just want to announce that we'll continue to do contributing efforts to make more live streams in the nearest futures. And also, guys, please subscribe. When you subscribe to our channels, on YouTube, please subscribe to enable notifications on Southfront YouTube channel, because some people are missing new videos because their notifications are not enabled. So please do that so that you keep up with everything that we're posting. All of the videos that we are producing, they're going to be helpful, just pure information on the situation in the global conflicts. So yeah, thank you for this great live stream. And
hey, Victor, I would also add that to all of our viewers and listeners here on this live stream to visit the Saker's website.
Oh yeah,
and also to donate to him, because he's one of those the voices of reason and pragmatism out there. He's one of the people that I first started reading his analysis and got me involved in what I do with Southfront, years ago. So I mean, he's stayed the course, man. He's like that steady North Star that never changes, man. And he's he's been at this for a long time, and he's that constant. So I encourage everybody to go visit his website, read his analysis, read the postings that he has on his website. He posts a lot of our stuff, and also some other analysis out there from some different bloggers and writers, and good stuff, man. So definitely support him.
Absolutely, I'm showing his website right now. So go to the Saker's website. It's thesaker.is. I'm showing you right now his donation page, and absolutely support independent media and alternative news. It's great for all of us. So we'll talk to you very soon. Hope to have another live stream in the nearest future. See you.